The gun covers should have been sealed. Every line technician knew the routine. But at RAF Biggin Hill, on June the 6th, 1941, a young airman named Arthur Spiggs Ellery paused for tea in the middle of his checks. The night had been cold, the humidity high, and his Spitfire's starboard gun bay vent remained slightly ajar. He never noticed. Neither did Flight Officer John Reynolds as he scrambled moments later toward a sky boiling with Dornier bombers and Messerschmitt 109s. What followed shouldn't have worked. Reynolds opened fire at 9,000 feet, all 8 of his 303 Brownings roaring in unison. Not a single one jammed. Not one. The cold altitude misfires that had plagued the squadron for weeks were gone. His rounds walked across the fuselage of a diving Du-17 like ink on paper. He downed 2 that sortie, unheard of, in early 41. When Reynolds landed, the ground crew noticed the vent, left open. And then the questions started. By accident, that T-brake had altered airflow through the gun ports just enough to prevent freezing. Engineers from Supermarine were called. They tested it, confirmed it. A single oversight led to a field adaptation. New vents were drilled by hand across the squadron, then added to the blueprint weeks later. That fluke became British doctrine. RAF engineers didn't need months. They didn't need a committee. They had a kettle, a hanger, and the kind of mechanical instinct you couldn't teach. From that day forward, Biggin Hill's Spitfires rarely jammed again, even when diving at 400 miles an hour through freezing cloud. And it wasn't just Biggin Hill. By July, the modification spread to Duxford, Hornchurch and beyond. The gun reliability rate across the RAF rose to over 97% in frontline squadrons. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was still suffering barrel icing and harmonisation drift after 10 sorties. Captured Luftwaffe pilot Franz Burmer, downed over Dover in July 1941, put it plainly: they always shoot first, they always hit first, we don't understand how. The Germans thought it was magic, but it was tea. It was accident. It was British grit shaping steel with sweat and boiled water. One Spitfire's loose panel. One pilot's perfect burst. One nation's answer to chaos with calm. And this was just the beginning. The wing design was next, and what it did to German nerves would be even harder to believe. June 11th, 1941. Flight Lieutenant Sidney Baker was barely 23 when he found himself alone above the channel, staring down the silver snarl of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 climbing into his 6, the sun behind him, the throttle wide. He didn't panic. He rolled left, then right, then doubled back so fast the German overshot. And in that split second, Baker's Spitfire hung in the air like it was painted there. He squeezed the trigger. The 109 exploded mid-climb. Baker didn't know it, but his victory came not just from training, it came from geometry. The elliptical wing of the Supermarine Spitfire wasn't about looks, it was about dominance. Designed by Reginald Mitchell, the wing reduced induced drag while preserving maneuverability at both high and low speeds. In plain English, it turned faster, flew cleaner, and didn't bleed energy like the square-cut wings of the Messerschmitt or Thunderbolt. The elliptical shape allowed uninterrupted airflow from wing root to tip. Combined with the wide track of the undercarriage and low wing loading, the Spitfire could make turns so tight, Luftwaffe pilots called them death spirals. The Bf 109 turned sharper than most American aircraft, but it was no match for the Spitfire at medium altitudes. At 12,000 feet, during the height of the Battle of Britain, RAF records showed that Spitfires completed a full 360-degree turn 2 full seconds faster than their German counterparts. In a dogfight, 2 seconds meant life or death. German pilot Hans Eberhard Wedemeyer once wrote in his flight log, "They don't fall, they curve like birds. Our guns are useless unless we shoot blind." He never made it home. His parachute was seen over Kent, floating to British fields and surrender. But it wasn't just turn radius. The wing's stiffness meant gun harmonisation held longer. While Luftwaffe aircraft required realignment every 8 to 10 sorties due to airframe vibration, Spitfires kept their precision across 25 or more missions. That's why, when they shot, they hit. The Americans, who later praised the P-51 Mustang for its range, quietly studied Spitfire wings for their manoeuvre profiles. They knew this wasn't just engineering, it was a statement. British pilots didn't need more metal, they needed better shape. And the shape worked. Over Dover, over Dieppe, over the sands of North Africa. That wing flew circles around the enemy, but it was only as deadly as the guns it carried. And those guns? They were next. 8 of them. Perfectly tuned and just as intentional. The roar was deafening at 15,000 feet, but Pilot Officer Clive Weston didn't flinch. It was September the 5th, 1941, and his target, a Junkers 88 diving toward the Thames estuary, was already within range. Weston eased in behind, flipped the gun switch and let go a 2-second burst. In that instant, 8 303 Browning machine guns stitched a line so tight across the fuselage that the bomber seemed to snap in half mid-air. No spray, no overcorrection, just precision. The world would later ask, why 8 guns? Why not cannons like the Germans? The answer was British doctrine, accuracy before aggression. From the earliest marks of the Spitfire, RAF Command prioritised lethality through coordination. Each wing held 4 Browning 303s, angled with terrifying precision to converge fire at 750 yards, then later refined to just 300 feet. That tight harmonisation meant a trained pilot could vaporise a target in under 2 seconds, provided he had the nerve to get close. And British pilots did. Their training demanded it. They learned to close the gap, to wait, to shoot, not in desperation but with calm focus. As Sergeant Pilot George Tubby Mellors described it, you had one chance to make 8 guns speak at once. If you couldn't taste their exhaust, you were too far. That mindset turned every Spitfire into a flying rifle, not a machine gun nest. This was where Britain stood apart. While German pilots peppered skies with cannon fire from 400 yards or more, Spitfire pilots aimed for tight, controlled impacts. The statistics were brutal. RAF after-action reports from 1942 noted that 72% of kills came from firing windows shorter than 3 seconds. The Luftwaffe's rate? Barely 31%, even with heavier caliber weapons. In the cockpit, it meant everything. Each Browning delivered 1,200 rounds per minute, and a 2-second burst released nearly 400 bullets, but they weren't wasted. They converged like a scalpel, not a hammer. Pilots didn't pull the trigger and hope. They held steady, aligned, and delivered judgment in streams of fire narrower than a fighter's wingspan. A captured German observer near Calais later said, "You could tell when a Spitfire hit. The plane didn't just go down, it vanished." 8 guns, firing as one. That was the British way. But even that wasn't enough. Because as the war dragged on, a question rose. What if precision wasn't enough against numbers? The answer came not from the sky, but from across the Atlantic. And Britain had a lesson waiting. In January of 1942, a squadron of freshly delivered American P-40 Warhawks stood gleaming on the tarmac at Debden Airfield. Their arrival was met with applause, curiosity, and quiet concern. British ground crews admired the rugged airframes and heavy armament, but when they watched them fly, a pattern emerged. The Americans fired early, fired wide, and often returned with full ammo boxes barely scratched. The problem wasn't courage, it was convergence. American doctrine harmonized machine guns to cross at 750 to 1,200 feet, designed for flexibility in formations and multi-angle attacks. British Spitfires, by contrast, had already evolved their harmonisation to a razor-sharp 250 feet, tight enough to focus every round into a space smaller than a German fuselage. That difference was more than preference, it was philosophy. British pilots didn't believe in warning shots, they believed in kills. In March that year, Lieutenant Alan Firth of the RAF sat beside an American pilot after a failed sweep over the Channel. The American had expended all his ammunition, 400 rounds from each of his 6 guns, and missed every target. Firth, sipping from a tin of sweetened tea, said, "You don't need more bullets. You need to get closer. You need to mean it." The numbers proved him right. Internal RAF stats from 1942 showed that Spitfire gunfire had a kill-to-shot efficiency nearly double that of American P-40s and P-47s in similar engagements. The Spitfire was not just flying, it was delivering precision fire in one of the deadliest 2-second bursts in air combat history. One German pilot, interrogated after bailing out over Dover, said, "They never flinch, they follow to the death, and when they shoot, we feel it." That fear grew with every sortie. While American fighters relied on wingmen and volume, Spitfires relied on isolation and accuracy. It was the sniper's approach in a battlefield of machine gunners, and Britain stuck with it. Even as America scaled up production and sent Mustangs across the ocean, the RAF kept refining its harmonisation, gun cooling, and trigger discipline. By 1943, RAF squadrons were being drilled not just to fire, but to wait, to feel the target, to own the moment of impact. And yet, for all the pilot training and tactical genius, the real revolution in firepower came not from the cockpit, but from a test flight. A flight where one man, high above Hampshire, risked everything to chase a fault, and changed aerial combat forever. His name was Geoffrey Quill, and he was about to turn engineering into a weapon. It was July 10th, 1942, and the clouds over Hampshire hung low and wet. Most pilots stayed grounded, but Geoffrey Quill, chief test pilot for Supermarine, rolled out Spitfire KB 981 with fuel tanks topped and his brow set. The latest variant had shown signs of freezing under hard dives, something the engineers couldn't replicate on the ground. Quill's job was simple: climb to 30,000 feet, throw the aircraft into a screaming dive, and don't die. What happened next changed British gunnery forever. At 29,000 feet, with oxygen hissing and the cockpit rattling from wind shear, Quill nosed down into a near-vertical drop. Ice formed instantly on the inner canopy. Controls stiffened. The fuel lines stuttered. And then the gun ports choked. He levelled out at 5,000 feet, heart pounding, and radioed the tower. "Freezing confirmed. Immediate ground inspection needed." It was the last piece of a puzzle that had started a year earlier with one airman's tea break. Quill's data showed that airflow through the gun ports wasn't just cooling the barrels, it was dragging moisture into the chambers at high altitudes. It had to be redirected. Within days, Supermarine engineers added widened venting ducts with revised baffles, reducing humidity by nearly 70% during dive testing. The result? Zero jamming under stress conditions. It was not a redesign, it was a recalibration, the kind the British excelled at. Quill later wrote, "War isn't won by brute strength. It's won by the inch between what works and what fails." That inch, in the Spitfire, became air superiority. The Spitfire became not just reliable, it became predictable. Pilots could rely on the machine's behaviour under G-forces and altitude changes, with a confidence no Luftwaffe pilot could claim. German engineers, relying on cannons' synchronization and heavier weaponry, struggled to achieve anything close to the consistent harmonization the RAF now delivered across dozens of squadrons. Captured German flight mechanic Dieter Reuss, interviewed after the North Africa campaign, put it bluntly: "They fix problems before they become defects." We wait until something explodes. The Spitfire's transformation from beautiful machine to surgical weapon wasn't born of factories. It was born of men like Quill, who pushed the envelope and brought back answers written in frost. And now, with a perfected wing and perfected fire control, Britain wasn't just surviving the skies, it was about to start owning them. Next came the numbers. Cold, brutal, mechanical proof that Britain's flying rifle was the most dangerous weapon in European airspace. Because when a machine could hit 25 missions without misalignment, the enemy knew resistance wasn't brave, it was suicidal. March 14th, 1943. On a scorched hillside near Dieppe, RAF recovery teams combed through the twisted wreckage of a downed Focke-Wulf 190. Amid the shattered airframe and scorched metal, one mechanic named Ellis Porter noticed something odd. The Germans' main gun mount had rattled loose in flight. It wasn't sabotage, it was fatigue. The airframe had vibrated so violently in recent missions that its weapon calibration had drifted beyond combat effectiveness. The guns simply weren't pointing where the pilot aimed. Porter smiled, then radioed the finding back to Duxford. What the Luftwaffe was discovering, painfully in wreckage, Britain had already solved. The Spitfire's firepower wasn't just built, it was maintained. Thanks to reinforced wing ribs, shock-mounted gun trays, and updated harmonisation jigs introduced by supermarine engineers in mid-1942, RAF armament crews could align all 8 Brownings to within half a degree of tolerance, and that alignment held across 25 sorties. German 190s and 109s needed recalibration every 8 to 10, often mid-combat rotation. By spring of 43, British pilots could depend on accuracy not just from training, but from a machine that remembered where it was told to shoot. Sergeant Jack "Lucky" Wilcox, who flew 71 missions with 303 Squadron, once said, "We didn't aim, we knew. My guns weren't just calibrated, they were loyal." That kind of confidence changed the psychology of combat. Pilots no longer had to adjust for drift. They focused entirely on flight and timing. The moment the target filled their sight, they fired, and results followed. The stats bore it out. Analysis from RAF Bomber Command revealed that aircraft equipped with the reinforced harmonisation mounts saw a 28% improvement in hit probability during 2-second bursts. In combat, that meant fewer wasted rounds, faster kills, and quicker disengagements, which meant more planes came home. It was cold arithmetic turned into human survival. The enemy noticed. Luftwaffe pilot Franz Kessler, captured after bailing over the Channel, confessed under interrogation, "Our guns walk off their mark by mission 3. Yours hit like they read minds." But it wasn't magic. It was routine. British ground crews worked through sleet, fog, and blackout to align fire systems down to the inch. They used mirrors, chalk lines, and steady hands. Every plane on the tarmac was treated like a marksman's rifle, cared for, calibrated, and counted on. And that rifle was about to get a voice. Because while British guns fired with unmatched precision, something else was brewing behind enemy lines: respect. In the camps, in the cells, among the captured, even in defeat, German soldiers were talking. What they said would shock even the British. It was a fog-heavy morning in October 1943 when RAF Corporal Elsie Radley sorted through confiscated belongings at Stalag Luft 6. Among the watches and ration books was a worn, leather-bound notebook, recovered from a downed Luftwaffe pilot named Hauptmann Otto Frisch. Inside, written in looping script across the top of a page, were 6 words that froze her breath mid-air. "The Spitfire is God's rifle." Frisch had been shot down over the coast of Suffolk. He bailed out after taking a single burst through the fuselage, one that sliced his hydraulic lines, fuselage skin, and port elevator. "I never saw him," he had said in interrogation, But I felt his bullets find me. It was like being judged from the clouds. That phrase spread across the prison like gospel. RAF guards pinned Frisch's note on the mess wall, where other German prisoners soon added to it. One scribbled underneath, "We fly with strength, they fly with fate." Another POW, Oberleutnant Erich Keller, reportedly confessed that after 3 encounters with Spitfires, we no longer feared death. We feared their silence before they struck. These weren't just frightened men, these were trained killers, seasoned Luftwaffe veterans, and they'd come to accept something chilling. You couldn't outturn a weapon you couldn't even see coming. Inside the wire, the talk shifted. POWs spoke of Spitfires as if they were something more than mechanical. Not fast, not big, but exact. They described being tracked with eyes that saw through mist and guns that never wandered. Some even joked the British must be using homing rounds. But the truth, of course, was simpler and more damning. It was calibration. It was convergence. It was courage. The Spitfire's harmonisation and pilot training turned it into a one-shot weapon in a sky full of noise. It wasn't the biggest gun, but it was the best used. And the respect it earned didn't end in the cockpit. It haunted every captured pilot who walked away from wreckage and into a prison cell. Even British guards noticed. Flight Sergeant Neil Dawson, who oversaw interrogation logs, remarked, "You can beat a man and he'll lie, but every one of them told the truth about the Spitfire. They said it fought like it knew their names." And this respect, this whispered fear, was built not on numbers, but results. Because the next variant of Spitfire didn't just fire straighter, it fired harder. And when Britain paired surgical aim with raw stopping power, the battlefield tilted permanently. The age of the Mach 9 had arrived, and the Luftwaffe was about to find out what real firepower felt like. On November 3rd, 1943, Flight Lieutenant Dennis Corky Bramall of number 611 Squadron soared above the Netherlands in a brand new Spitfire Mach 1C. Beneath his wings purred the future. 2 20mm Hispano Mark II cannons and 4 303 Brownings, all tuned to converge at precisely 250 feet. No guesswork, no spray, just one devastating moment of truth. At 23,000 feet, Bramall spotted a flight of 3 Focke-Wulf 190s crossing toward Arnhem. He pulled behind the lead aircraft and fired a 2-second burst. The Hispano shells ripped through the German fighter before the pilot even knew he was being hunted. Bramall peeled off. 2 more Spitfires moved in and finished the job. The whole engagement lasted under 20 seconds. 3 kills. No British losses. This was the M9 effect. A precision-tuned flying weapon guided by doctrine, discipline and sheer will. When the RAF began deploying the Mach 9 in mid-1942 to counter the Focke-Wulf 190, it wasn't just speed that changed, it was philosophy. Every element of the gun platform was reassessed. Harmonisation drills grew stricter. Armourers received new calibration tools, gunners trained in convergence ranges to match squadron-specific tactics. The result? Firepower that hit like a hammer and cut like a scalpel. Squadron leader George "Grumpy" Unwin described it best. It wasn't a gun platform, it was a judgment machine. You lined it up and it gave you closure. During Operation Ramrod missions in early 1944, Unwin racked up 6 kills in 3 days, all from within 300 feet, firing bursts under 2 seconds. RAF combat logs showed staggering results. On average, Spitfire Mach 9 squadrons scored a confirmed kill every 360 rounds fired, less than half the rate of earlier models. German pilots, flying in tight formation to protect themselves, began splitting prematurely when a Spitfire entered their rear quarter. British dominance was no longer theoretical, it was mathematical. and the enemy knew it. A surviving Luftwaffe Staffelkapitän, Karl-Heinz Werner, captured after being shot down near Lille, said under interrogation, "Your men shoot like they've already won. They fire and it's final." The RAF didn't just add firepower, they added certainty. Every bullet had purpose. Every cannon round had direction. It was no longer about air superiority, it was about air ownership. And yet, as shocking as this lethality became, what followed in the data stunned even Allied command. Because by 1944, Britain's Spitfires weren't just feared, they were setting records. Gun-kill ratios, sortie survivability, fire discipline, the numbers told a story of mastery. And when those figures hit the desks in Whitehall, one statistic changed how history would remember British engineering forever. By March of 1944, the war in the skies had shifted from survival to supremacy, and Britain was leading the charge with numbers that left even its allies speechless. In a debriefing room at Whitehall, Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory unfolded a single page of combat analysis and tapped his pen against the top line. "Gentlemen," he said, "this isn't victory by chance, this is victory by mathematics." The page showed it all. Over 1 million sorties had been flown by Spitfires since the war began. And now, with the Mk9 and Mk1 variants leading the front, the average gun-hit efficiency across RAF fighter squadrons had reached an unprecedented 27%. That meant for every 100 bullets fired, 27 found their mark, the highest rate of any Allied or Axis aircraft. The Luftwaffe's average hovered at just under 15%, even with larger cannon calibers. American fighters, including the revered P-51 Mustang, typically fell in the range of 10 to 12%. The Spitfire wasn't just a better aircraft, it was a better weapon. 2-second bursts, fired from within 250 feet, with convergence perfected to within a hand's breadth. RAF combat gunners weren't trained to empty their belts. They were trained to wait, to squeeze at the perfect moment. And when they did, enemy planes didn't peel off. They disappeared. Squadron leader Alec Maddox once described his last kill this way. "It was like slicing silk. I fired one burst. He vanished behind a cloud and never came out." His logbook noted 430 rounds fired over 6 missions, 6 kills, 1 scratch on his fuselage. 1. These results weren't flukes. They were the outcome of years of painful refinement, from Reginald Mitchell's first sketches to that accidental tea-break vent to Geoffrey Quill's death-defying dives. Britain didn't just build planes, it sculpted precision. Every rivet, every gun sight, every harmonisation chart was a step toward absolute control in the chaos of aerial war. Even German analysts, captured in the aftermath of the Normandy push, admitted in internal memos that British gunnery exceeds tactical expectation. Their convergence doctrine may be impossible to counter. One Luftwaffe general reportedly said, "If we had their Spitfire, we might still have hope." But they didn't, because no other nation built machines with such care. No other people fought with such ponderance, courage and clarity. And no one, not in Berlin, not in Washington, matched the way Britain turned small machines into towering legends. 1 gun vent, 1 harmonisation jig, 1 set of wings. And a million stories of deadly accuracy that began, incredibly, with a man taking a tea break in the rain.